Hi, we continue in Genesis 24 today after Abraham has called the oldest servant of his household and given him instructions to go back to Abraham's birthplace with no map or GPS or any other kinds of specific directions or instructions to go find a wife for his son Isaac. And now, as we continue in the passage, we'll listen to the qualifications and questions a servant has before he sets out on this astounding journey. So you see on the right side of the screen, we've been following the key words, and there are lots and lots of key words in this longest chapter and longest story in the entire book of Genesis. But often they're focused on a particular passage, as we see today, with not surprisingly the question of the woman many times. But also in this section, as I mentioned briefly last time, land is mentioned 6 times and Isaac one time, whereas in the end it's exactly the opposite. Isaac 6 times and land 1 time, as a way of framing. So just some of the subtle but clear ways our authors try to bring coherence to this entire chapter, this entire long chapter. So another tool we're looking at is how, in the story that we're hearing in the first round here, how it will be told differently in the second round. So I just want to bring that up as an example. We'll obviously look at it in more detail when we get there. But here's the original, what we're getting now. And just to note that when the servant retells it to Laban and the household, he will tell it in a little bit different way, sometimes very different way, and we're allowed as readers to be able to compare the two. It's a rare situation where the authors and editors include this much repeated dialogue, and we'll see it again too. Not only will he repeat the encounter between Abraham and the servant that we're in the midst of right now, but he'll repeat the encounter that he has with Rebekah at the well or spring, also when he gets back in the house, and there's much detail on that. So that'll be one of the things that both Sternberg and Menachem Perry help us with. Sternberg, the older article that we've been looking at, and that's from his book, Poetics of Biblical Narrative, where he uses this chapter as an example of his various methodologies. And then almost 30 years later, his early writing partner, Menachem Perry, reading the story again, but from the perspective of the servant. Rather than the usual perspective of Abraham or Rebekah. So it'll be interesting to hear how when you listen to the story from one perspective, you hear some things, and from another perspective, you notice other things. We'll get more of that as we go. So let's put our keywords up, which also, besides being keywords, is my attempt to translate it more precisely to the Hebrew, and also to allow the keywords to be translated the same way each time, when the new RSV on the left side often translates the same word differently, apparently for variation. So we left it with verse 4, after Abraham had told him, "Go to my country and my kindred," which we already noticed that Sternberg helped us see as Hendiadys, for my place of my birth, and get a wife for my son Isaac. And so we pick up here with the servant's response. And I'll put back up on the screen here what I showed last time, this little chiasm that goes from verse 2 to verse 9 that frames the section that we looked at last time, and also the section we're in today. So, as we start on verse 9 here, as my note below says, the servant expresses the other risk that we looked at last time, a failure of the prospective wives to accept the call to leave as Abraham did, and offers the only remaining option instead. And he doesn't express any objection to the enormity of their request that he should travel, perhaps alone, although we'll see not alone, even though it seems like it's alone at this point, to a distant land with a very difficult ask. So he begins this way: "Perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me." And that's a very specific echo, and we'll look at it from 1824, of Abraham's discussion with God about innocent and guilty people in Sodom. Let's look at that, where he says, "Suppose that there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then not sweep away the place?" And we hear, of course, how Yahweh relents each time. But what that echo suggests, perhaps, is that in this scene, Abraham is in the position of Yahweh and the servant is in the position of Abraham, parallel to chapter 12. In the initial call, and we noted last time that Genesis 24 has many specific parallels, not only with Genesis 12 at the beginning of the Abraham cycle, then Abram, but many other parallels along the way, pulling it all together. But perhaps what we're seeing here is as Yahweh called Abram, without Abram knowing it was Yahweh, to leave the place of his birth, now Yahweh is telling the servant to go back to the place of his birth. But there's no specific word from Yahweh other than what we'll see in verse 7, where Abraham claims in a quote that we never heard in the text that Yahweh had made this order. But we don't know that. We have to just take Abraham's word for it, that that's what he's telling the servant. And what we don't don't know is he using rhetoric about Yahweh on the servant, just as the servant will use rhetoric about Yahweh on both Rebekah and on Laban. But only a definitive word from the narrator would be enough to have us be sure that this is the truth. So we have to leave it as simply Abraham's statement without us knowing whether it's true or not. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's go back and continue to look at the servant's question. So perhaps the woman, and notice that Sternberg notes here that it suggests the servant knows specifically of whom Abraham is speaking, even though he is not named in the midst of the spatial opposition between this land and there. And we see that there and land is clearly key words in this section here. Although it doesn't have to mean the specific woman, like he knows it's Rebekah or some woman like that. To simply be, suppose he finds a woman and the woman may not be willing to come back. So we can read that either way. May not be willing here, or that phrase also in verse 8, as we see, is part of the chiasm. And as my note below says, a woman to marry in this family could not be unwilling to go, which is, of course, the point of Abraham's going. And one of the questions they're going to be, as we'll see, are what are the criteria for this wife? We'll see what the servant thinks the criteria are when he sees Rebekah at the well. But is he seeing with the eyes of Yahweh? And we'll have to look at that as we go. So, may not be willing to follow me, or literally to go, as we saw. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? And notice how he's framing that. He doesn't frame it open-endedly, like, what should I do? But he offers this as if it's the only option. Must I then take your son back? Another option could be find another woman. You've got the whole land before you. There's got to be one that'll come, if not that one, especially when they see what you bring with you, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. But he frames it this way, and Abraham responds in this way, sort of. The question is, must I then take your son back? Literally, return, yes, return. Here it is, must I return, yes, return. So, from the land from which you came. Notice how it's framing it. It doesn't say birthplace or kindred or anything about family, simply the subtraction of the previous land. So from the servant's perspective, there's no family association with it and no emotional resonance of Abraham having memories from that place. It's just simply another place on the map. And the question isn't about the place. The question is about whether he should take the son back. Again, notice it not named here. So Abraham's final words in Genesis are these verses we're going to quote here. And very interestingly, and again, this is just one of the ways the authors work, over against those who would see the authors as clumsy editors who leave tracks that modern commentators can easily find. Instead, what we find is that an intricate and intimate connection of verbal and thematic connections that pull the whole thing into a tightly woven fabric. So here we see Abraham's last words echoing his first words to God in 15:2. Let's see, it's almost like it's a question and answer. So back in 15:2, Abraham said, O Lord Yahweh, what will you give me, for I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus? And he continues, you have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. Which is what leads many readers to assume that the servant in our given passage is that Eleazar of Damascus, but the authors could have said so, and they don't say so. But what it certainly brings up, the rhetorical question there was, I have no heir, all I have is this servant, and now he's speaking to the servant about not taking his son back there, and the servant later in the story will say that the son is the heir. So in Abraham's first words to God and his last words to anybody in the text is a little question and answer there. And then we get another echo, not just intratextually within Genesis, but intertextually to the last verse of 2 Chronicles and the first verse of Ezra, which in the canonical sequence follow directly from each other. Originally, once upon a time, those would have been separate scrolls, of course, but once it became a codex or anything like a book, they're just adjoining pages, as we'll see. So let's see what he says, and then we'll see how it echoes, not just verbally, but thematically. Yahweh, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and again, that can be one thing, from my birthplace, and who spoke to me, this is land of my birth is one thing, father's house is plainly a separate thing, spoke to me and swore to me. Let's just look at that part so far. Yahweh, the God of heaven. And this is what we need to look at. These verses are only one verse in between. Let's look at how it's repeated here. So the very last verse of 2 Chronicles. Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, Yahweh, the God of heaven, exactly parallel, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may Yahweh his God be with him, let him go up. And notice after the first verse of Ezra, we see the exact same thing repeated. It's worth paying attention to what's being named there. We've already seen that the question of marrying somebody was a key theme of the Ezra and Nehemiah, and they reached the conclusion, the authors of Ezra do, in chapter 9 and 10 of the book of Ezra, that it's marrying foreign women that was the cause of the exile and led the people astray. It led them to worship other gods, and so now if they're going to be part of this new community with this rebuilt Jerusalem temple, they have to get rid of their foreign wives and their foreign wives' children and vow never again to marry a foreign wife, calling upon texts like Deuteronomy, as we saw, that see the people of the land as if they're an infection and need to be avoided. Now, we already saw that Abraham told the servant, don't have my son marry a Canaanite, but no reason was given for that here. But this phrase here, whether from 2 Chronicles or as we see it from Ezra, suggests that the Persian king is doing Yahweh, the God of heaven's rule, and has charged him to build a house, and that everything that's happening under the Ezra-Nehemiah narrative is Yahweh's will. But is it? I'd suggest the authors of Genesis many times are taking issue with that, and nobody has done more to make the connections between the Persian era situation in Genesis than Mark Brett, who we looked at last time. So more could be said about that, but for our purpose we'll stop here, noting that in the Chronicles Ezra thing, the call of the Persian king from Persia to people in Babylon is to go back to the original land, which is to say Judea and Jerusalem, although it'll be called Yehud under Persian rule. Here, while they're in the land, Abraham is calling on Yahweh, the God of heaven, to send someone back to the old country, but not to take his son back there. So definitely echoing back and forth about both about place and, as we'll see, about who you can marry. So let's look a little more closely at what he says, that Yahweh, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house, here we saw right in 12:1, and we also saw it in 20:13, and from the land of my birth, paralleling verse 4, and also again recalling 12:1. And now we have to raise the question, who spoke to me and swore to me, saying, to your offspring I will give this land. Okay, that's from 12:7. But how about this? He will send his angel before you. That's from Exodus and Numbers. And as Westerman notes, these passages which speak of leading the people through the desert are presupposed in verse 7. And no doubt about that, the image of sending his angel before you is certainly an image of coming out of Egypt or coming out of exile. Literally before your face, as the phrase often is, which Perry suggests taking quite literally, that it'll literally be before the messenger will be before the servant's face. And you shall take a wife for my son from there. And notice the there repeated here. There, 4 times in this brief little passage. Notice he won't name the place, he'll just call it there. And the servant has no specific knowledge of what that place is. So now finally, Abraham gets to the question that he asked about the women not being willing to follow. And as Perry notes here, and since Isaac should not be brought back to Mesopotamia, if the woman refuses to follow him back to the land of Canaan, Isaac will not be able to marry. And then what? Let God sort that out. Which is to say that maybe Abraham hasn't completely thought that one through yet. But here's what he says. If the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine, or literally exempt from obligation. Translating that according to the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon there as part of a legal obligation, as is fitting here, that he's taking a formal oath, and if the woman's not willing, then the servant can't execute it, and he's exempt from the oath. And here's the word for swearing here, and we only see it one other time, this particular word here in Genesis, and that will be around Isaac. And notice again that this is putting Abraham in the place of God, that Abraham and Yahweh take oaths together, and so now it's an oath between Abraham and the servant. Only you must not take my son back there. helping to fit the chiasm. And so now what was invited in the beginning happens. So now, having gotten the questions clarified and knowing exactly what he's going to do, now the servant is ready to engage in the oath, putting his hand under the thigh of his master, and swore to him concerning this matter, concerning this word. And let's just continue one verse down, even though the unit at one level ends here, because I'd like to at least set up the scene of what comes when we see the servant arriving at the well in our next video. So here we have as my note has, the entire journey is narrated in one verse, even though, as we saw, it's 900 kilometers and a long distance. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels. And here you can see what 10 camels packed up look like. But I want to note, just like in this image, camels were not normally for riding on. Camels are like a fleet of luxury SUVs here as limousines. It's a way of showing off wealth. Yes, camels are pack animals and they'd be valuable for taking all those things, but he certainly doesn't need 10 of them. This is a way of signaling to whoever he meets along the way, and especially to a prospective wife's family, that if you send your daughter back, she's certainly not going to be poor. So 10 of the master's camels, and as my note has below from Sternberg, most say anachronistic in this period, but if we look at 1216, where he got camels from Pharaoh, the only previous mention, here they are essential from the story, and as Sternberg notes, from a measure of Abraham's wealth it transforms into a measure of his daughter-in-law's worthiness to enjoy it. And he departed, taking all kinds of choice gifts, or literally all the good from his master. And the narrator is leaving us some wonderful suspense for us here, because we don't know what those gifts are. It's a little bit like, with a different motivation, Abigail packing up her donkey with gifts for David, but there it was extortion, and here it's courtship. But both of those situations end up with the gifts leading to a wedding. So given all the parallels between the David story we've been seeing, the Genesis story, perhaps that's not too far off. But at least in that story, we as readers get to know what Abigail packed on her donkey to bring his gifts, and here we don't. And he set out and went, and notice it's telling us an exact place he went, even though Abraham had not mentioned a place. And let's look at that on the map a little bit here, right here, and then we can look at what the word might mean. A region on the middle Euphrates, and it translates as Mesopotamia, the city of Nahor, because as Sarnanux, the Septuagint, took the word Naharim as a dual form, which is part of how Hebrew works, meaning two rivers, thus Mesopotamia, between the two rivers. But the Targums, which are the Aramaic commentaries on the Hebrew, later for people who couldn't read Hebrew, take a more limited geographic view, interpreting it correctly as the land along the river, or the land within the river, accordance with Egyptian Al-Amarna text. And so, whether we think of it as Mesopotamia here, or the land along the river here, that's where he's going back. And to the city of Nahor, which we noted, and we'll see it again as it's mentioned here, goes under 3 different names, expressing for us as readers some of the very confusion that's at issue in this chapter, as we go back to an old country that isn't clear exactly of its identity, with a family that isn't clear exactly of its relationship with his servant with his 10 camels. So we'll see that first encounter between the servant and Rebekah at the well next time. See you for that then.